All right, well, we've got a lot of people here, so shall we get going? So welcome everyone. We're very excited to welcome Hamilton Morris, the chemist, filmmaker, and science journalist, and a graduate of the New School University. Hamilton conducts chemistry research at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia, and he's a writer and director of the award-winning documentary series Hamilton's Pharmacopeia, and we'll be very excited to show the fourth episode of the new series, Natural Tramadol, Artificial Ibogaine, which explores opioid addiction in West Africa and the traditional use of Ibogaine, which many of you may know is a psychedelic currently undergoing clinical trials for addiction medicine. And then afterwards, Hamilton will be giving a talk and discussing more about his work, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions. So just as a warning, this documentary contains scenes of ritual animal sacrifice in a tribal setting. So if you prefer not to watch those parts, then they take place right at the start and then again in the second half, so you can look away if you want to. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Hamilton. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk about this episode because it's, I think, one of the stranger things I've ever made. It's something that I'm proud of, and I think that it tells a very interesting story in a way that it hasn't been told before. There have been quite a few documentaries made about Iboga and even Iboga in West Africa, but this is the first piece ever made about the use of Iboga to treat opioid addiction in West Africa. Typically, it's a white outsider who's addicted to heroin who then goes and experiences a treatment in a Bwiti tradition. But what I always found somewhat ironic about that is that in the culture where this actually is a tradition, there is now a widespread problem with abuse of the synthetic opioid Tramadol. And this same group that has been, their traditions have been used around the world to treat opioid addiction is not using it themselves until very recently. So I wanted to capture this transformation that's taking place culturally, where you have a plant that was used more than anything as a religious sacrament that is now being used as a medicine to treat opioid addiction. And so I followed a local tramadol addict named Rocky as he underwent this ceremony and experienced this transformation where he was able to stop using tramadol. So that's kind of the basic idea of this piece, but there are also a lot of, I think, interesting ideas about reflecting perspectives on the synthetic natural dichotomy, which I would like to talk about later. So it's a complicated story. It has to be followed closely and watched carefully, but I hope you all enjoy it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions anyone might have afterwards.
Well, that was an awesome piece of filmography and hugely informative and insightful. So thanks so much to Hamilton for sharing it with us. And I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. And I should say, for anyone that hasn't watched any of Hamilton's documentaries before, I'd thoroughly recommend watching them. You can watch the previous seasons on Vice or on Channel 4 if you're in the UK. So Hamilton is now going to give us a bit of a talk. Are you all set for that?
Yes, I'm set to do it. I'm looking at this chat section. What a nightmare. Okay. Jesus, this is not a good way to screen a film. It's like if a film screening were just listening to everyone else in the theater talking over the film instead of actually listening to what people are saying. Kind of
Yes,
but
we should have disabled that. Sorry.
But yeah, so just a little bit of background on this. I saw one person saying that this is not a low-tech process for the production of Ibogaine. Just to be clear, it absolutely is. And Chris Jenks was a little bit conflicted about using some of that equipment because he knew that people would say exactly what people in the chat section are saying, like, how dare you use a magnetic stir bar? How dare you use a sock slit extractor? It can all be done without those tools. He was merely demonstrating the process, and it was kind of difficult to do it because he's in California, and of course the production of Ibogaine is illegal in the United States. So in order to show that process, Chris Jenks isolated voacangine on camera. I then brought the isolated voacangine to my friend's lab at Columbia, Mike Cunningham, who works with another chemist named Dalibor Samis, who's one of the leading experts on the structure-activity relationship of ibogaine derivatives. And they demethylated the oxygen on the BOACAN gene, not the ester oxygen, but the indole oxygen, to produce norBOACAN gene. Then they did the demethoxycarbonylation reaction. So that's the lengths that I went to in order to actually show this chemistry, which was illegal in the United States. So the final product of that reaction is actually noribogaine instead of ibogaine, but the chemistry is identical. It's a reflux and alcohol with a base. So yeah, I mean, just a little bit of background. I think that there's a lot of different things going on in this piece that have been interesting to me for a long time. One is the synthetic natural dichotomy and how we characterize it in our culture. There's a widespread idea that things that are natural are good and that things that are chemical are bad. And this is a kind of obnoxious, hypocritical, inconsistent idea because everything is simultaneously natural and simultaneously synthetic, depending on how you want to characterize it. And I'm always looking for examples that either puncture this boundary or turn it on its head in some interesting way. And when the group of Boumengel published their research in 2013 in Engravante Chimie, it was a very exciting moment because you had this substance, Tramadol, which was discovered in the 60s in Germany. It's not only is it a synthetic pharmaceutical opioid, it bears very little structural resemblance to any natural product. Like there are synthetic opioids like heroin that are, just an ester of morphine or some small variant of morphine. This is something that really does not look like anything found in nature. And then to think that Tramadol, this fully synthetic, fully artificial compound, was not only natural, but had been part of the traditional medical practices of these Central West African countries for generations. I felt like, what a beautiful example of how arbitrary these distinctions are. So I was fascinated by it. Then when the opposing papers were published by Spitaler, the story got even more interesting because it went from a case of just this bizarre discovery of a relatively high concentration, 0.4% tramadol in the root of Nauplea latifolia. But Spitaler's group showed that it was actually a product of cattle addiction, that cows were being given tramadol and their urine was contaminating the soil and being absorbed by Nauplea latifolia. And they had pretty decent evidence, I would say not for the cow part of it, but for the idea that it was not naturally occurring. So just to go over that very briefly, most natural products, because they are synthesized by enzymes, are enantiopure. They only occur with one stereoisomer. The supposed phytotramadol was a racemate. That in and of itself is highly, highly unusual. So the question then was, well, how can we even tell? Like you'd think with all of the technology that we have, that assessing whether or not something is natural in origin should be relatively easy. But what I think is so amazing is two laboratories that are arguing to this day about the results, each coming up with new evidence to demonstrate that the other one's wrong, and it still remains unresolved. And what I think is even funnier than that is I think both groups are wrong. I think both groups have made a mistake. So the evidence for it being synthetic is that it's a racemate, that, and more importantly, that it did not contain radiocarbon. And I don't know if everyone here is familiar with this. I don't know what level of, I don't want to just, explain stuff that everyone already knows, but just to very briefly go over it, there are these things, they're high energy particles called cosmic rays. The cosmic rays bombard nitrogen in the atmosphere and they create a radioisotope of carbon called carbon-14. Carbon-14 then reacts with oxygen and you get radio CO2. The CO2 is absorbed by plants and integrated into the tissue of those plants and into the alkaloids that the plants biosynthesize. Okay, so if you're wondering, is there a difference between something that's natural and something that's synthetic? There is a difference, and that difference is that the natural materials are likely to be slightly radioactive due to the presence of carbon-14. If something is made from petroleum or made from fossil materials that are millions of years old, all of the radiocarbon will have disappeared tens of thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. So if there were no radiocarbon in the tramadol that had been isolated from these plants, that would be evidence that it was actually of pharmaceutical origin, and that was the case. So as far as I'm concerned, this idea that it's produced by plants is not supported. That's very strong evidence, in my opinion, that it came from plants. But the question remains, where did all this tramadol come from? Because they did agree on the fact that there was tramadol distributed throughout the environment in West Africa. How did this happen? Well, that's the real mystery. And, it's very hard to travel to the north of Cameroon. I actually had to sign some papers saying that, I would indemnify the corporation that was funding the production of this in case I was killed, because there's all this Boko Haram concern, and it was very, very hard to travel there. We actually ended up just working with locals in this region called Marua, and we were not able to find any evidence whatsoever of cows consuming tramadol. So that was kind of like a joke. I don't predict that there is widespread cattle consumption of tramadol, because I agree with DeWard, it doesn't make sense. I mean, there's all the different perspectives of the story are bizarre and don't make a lot of sense. What really happened, if I had to guess, I would think it's maybe humans peeing on the plants that are using large quantities of tramadol, or maybe there was a pharmaceutical dumping incident, or who knows what. But the real point here is, one, that we're living in a world that is increasingly contaminated by the products of human activity, and two, that what better example could you ask for of the prevalence of opioid use in Central West Africa than environmental contamination so severe that natural product chemists are arguing violently about whether or not this stuff is actually being produced by plants, because it's all over the environment. So that was the kind of the starting point of the documentary. And I thought it was an interesting way to get into this larger issue of tramadol use in Central West Africa. And, I have a lot of empathy for the people that are using tramadol in those regions, because unlike people in the United States, they do not grow up in a culture that's inundated with stories about the dangers of opioids. At least in the United States, there was this kind of, I think, vaguely ridiculous idea during the height of the so-called opioid epidemic that no one knew oxycodone was addictive. Well, I find that a little bit suspect, because I certainly knew it was addictive when I was in middle school. So I don't understand how all these physicians are claiming that they had no idea that it was addictive, or that they'd been fooled by evil pharmaceutical companies into believing that it wasn't addictive. The fact is, at least in the United States, you are brought up on a diet of horror stories about the dangers of opioid addiction. You have Requiem for a Dream, Train Spotting, Permanent Midnight, Christian F., and so on and so forth. You have tons and tons of stories about how horrible opioids are. And so you have this stereotypical vision of what it looks like to become a junkie that everyone, I think, is aware of when they start to go down that road. The same is not true in Central West Africa, where there's no history of use of these compounds, where it's basically a cultural unknown. And so I think that they are uniquely predisposed to encountering problems. On top of that, there is a somewhat predatory market that has emerged where ultra high potency, I believe 225 milligram instant release tramadol tablets are being mass produced and sold very inexpensively. So you have very, very cheap, very high potency tramadol that's widely distributed throughout Cameroon and Gabon. Okay, so that's, and also the DRC and all over the place. I've seen it all over Central and West Africa. So there's this problem that's emerged, but then at the same time, you have a religion. You have this syncretic Christian religion that sees the iboga shrub as the tree of knowledge of good and evil described in the Christian Bible. And they have developed a beautiful and elaborate ritual that is now being repurposed for treatment of opioid addiction in their own community. So that's really what this documentary was about. But then you have a final layer, which is that Iboga is a slow growing shrub. It's hard to grow. I don't know if anyone here has ever grown it before. It's not easy. You can sometimes get the seeds. The seeds take months to germinate under the best conditions, at least outside of Gabon. And then they tend to die, even after they germinate. It's really hard to get it to work, at least in a kind of colder climate like you probably are living in right now, and I certainly am living in. So this is not an easy plant to cultivate. On top of that, it's not a very potent plant by weight. So you need to consume very large quantities of it. In this 5-day ritual, the participants might be consuming the equivalent of an entire shrub or an entire tree, or maybe even several trees. So you can imagine how easy it would be to decimate the wild population. So then the question emerges, how can this be done sustainably? And that's what I think Chris Jinks has figured out so beautifully, is you have this other taxonomically related plant called Boa conga africana that produces a related alkaloid called boacangine. And boacangine is just ibogaine, but it has a methyl ester attached to it that can be cleaved via refluxing in base and alcohol. And then you have ibogaine. And this is actually how most ibogaine is produced now. So this can be done low tech, right? He was doing it in his home lab. He did take advantage of some of the things that he had so that we could do it in a shorter period of time. But he has taught people in Africa to do this. In fact, he spent quite a bit of time teaching people to empower communities in West Africa and teach them how this can be done. So it absolutely can be done low tech. I just want to emphasize that because I felt bad when I saw these people saying like, haha, that's not low tech. It is low tech. He just happened to use what he had, but you don't need to use a sock slit extractor. There's other ways to do it. And if you go to Chris Jenks's website, which is, I believe, puzzlepiece.org, you can learn more about the specifics of his process, which is, I think, really beautifully done. And he's dedicated a lot of his life to doing this. So I think his work is commendable in terms of creating a method that makes Iboga available to as many people as possible, because the total synthesis of it is just pretty darn tricky. So that's I guess that's what I could say is like an intro spiel. I could go on and on because I find all this stuff really interesting, but if anyone has specific questions, I would love to answer them.
Yeah, thanks. That was really insightful. Thanks for sharing with us. What we usually do is ask people if they want to ask a question, type it in the chat, and then I can ask it. Or if they want to ask it themselves, then just say, I have a question and I'll come to you. And that might be easier. Would you prefer either of those? Or
either is fine with me.
Okay. So there's a few questions already in the chat. So should I go with some here?
Sure.
So from Bella, I was wondering if you have any opinions on the best way to integrate Ibogaine outside of the Bwiti culture.
It really depends on what the purpose is, for religious use, for treatment of addiction, it just depends entirely. I would go so far as to say that I imagine the majority of Ibogaine is already used outside of the Bwiti religion. Although it's kind of hard to say that with certainty, but it's a pretty big market. I mean, there are clinics operating right now in Mexico and Canada and the Netherlands that see enormous numbers of patients, and also many other countries. So we've already developed this alternate history of Ibogaine that was started by a man named Howard Lotsoff, who was a teenage heroin addict in New York City who got Ibogaine from a chemist friend in the 60s, and he took it to trip, not to cure addiction or anything like that. And he found that he not only lost his craving for heroin, but that his attitude toward heroin had changed. And he started to associate heroin with death and found it undesirable. And he was so impressed by this effect, which again, this was something he discovered just based on personal observation, which is why I think everyone should really take their experiences with these things really seriously and do their absolute best to think about how they're responding, because that's all that happened. He was just a guy that took a chemical and made this world-changing discovery as a result of thinking carefully about how he responded to it. So yeah, so that's, you know, for treatment of addiction, there's all these clinics that have already emerged. For religious use, there's also kind of, you know, if you, there's people in Mexico that do religious, spiritual Ibogaine ceremonies as well, that are not part of the Bwiti tradition. And I don't know very much about, I've met some of the shamans that do that. You know, it seems to be the case increasingly that these non-traditional, non-indigenous shamans who they'll just kind of integrate whatever works into their practice and create their own rituals. So it's not unusual to hear of a ceremony where somebody drinks ayahuasca, then they take Ibogaine, and then they smoke 5-MeO-DMT on the final day or something like that. And I'm not making any claims about whether that's a good or a bad thing. I've never done it. I don't know. It seems like under the right circumstances, it could be beneficial.
Okay, awesome. So from Diana, we've got another question. How long do you reckon it will take for the natural synthetic dichotomy to completely dissolve? Is it something you can see happening in the near future?
Well, I mean, it's happening all around us. I mean, it's happening more than I think we even realize. And I think it has already happened. There's so many things where, you know, you look at, for example, mercury in the ocean. Is mercury in the ocean natural? Well, it's natural in the sense that it was on Earth. We didn't synthesize the mercury. It came as a product of gold refining, industrial activity, the burning of coal. Then all that metallic mercury enters the water, and then microbial interaction with the metallic mercury produces highly toxic organomercury compounds, specifically methyl mercury, that have now made it so that it's not safe for pregnant women to eat fish. Is that a natural thing? I mean, it came from burning coal that came here. I don't know whether that's natural or not. I think it's hard to say. You know, there are an increasing number of instances where it's hard to say. There's one that I find very fascinating where you have these polybrominated diphenyl ether fire retardants that are used all over the place. If you're sitting in an office chair right now, it wouldn't surprise me if there's some of that sprayed into the foam or the fabric, because it's in many countries required by regulation. Well, it also happens to be the case that there are sponges that produce polybrominated diphenyl ethers. And it's become hard to tell whether it's a natural product or whether it's a product of anthropogenic contamination, or maybe it's a hybrid of the two. Maybe some fire retardants are entering the water supply, and the same enzymes that are able to biosynthesize or brominate this or that diphenyl ether are then brominating the pollutants. And as our natural environment becomes increasingly totally permeated with pollution, it's a necessary result that organisms will begin to use these compounds that are ubiquitous in our environment as biosynthetic precursors for all sorts of new types of natural products. I mean, that's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I don't know, it's a difficult one. Masha has, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I could talk about this, I could talk about that all day. I find it very, very fascinating.
Yeah, no, I mean, from my personal point of view, I know a lot of people who love their psychedelics and love the science, but can't shake this kind of feeling of something spiritual and natural. And I think it may come from the same kind of propaganda that has led to the war on drugs, the whole idea that natural is good and synthetic is bad.
Yes, yeah.
From Masha, we've got a question about the possibility of Ibogaine helping people with Parkinson's. So she says that you mentioned it before and was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit.
Yes, I have mentioned it before with reservation, because you have to be very, very careful anytime you're talking about highly speculative use of a untested medication to treat a chronic disorder, whether it's cancer or a neurodegenerative disease. And there are a number of people that use Ibogaine as a treatment for Parkinson's. It does not seem to be anything approaching a miracle cure, that's for sure, at least from what I've seen. I know there are reports. I would like more information. I also am aware of reports that it did not help all that much as well. And I think that in our wishful thinking, in our hope that these substances can help us in so many different ways, we have a tendency to always emphasize what is good. And if somebody with Parkinson's disease takes Ibogaine and they experience no therapeutic effect, no one publishes that. Nobody talks about that. And so you end up with this extremely biased series of reports that only come from people who have experienced what they believe is a therapeutic effect. But also there's a lot of variation in the progression of Parkinson's disease. So it could be the case that this one person who seems to have experienced a really prominent therapeutic effect had slowly progressing Parkinson's, and that the Ibogaine wasn't helping, or maybe it was. And just to be clear for anyone that doesn't already know, there is a neurotrophic factor called Gdnf, glial-derived neurotrophic factor, and it has been evaluated pretty extensively as a therapeutic intervention for Parkinson's, including a very invasive intervention where it's pumped directly into the brain. So there's a decent bit of evidence that Ibogaine can promote the release of Gdnf. So that is the hypothetical mechanism of how it might exert this anti-Parkinson's effect. And I think it's worth studying, and I certainly hope that it helps people, but I would be very cautious in terms of recommending that people with Parkinson's disease who are very vulnerable use this without a lot of thought and a lot of care, especially because it also has the potential for cardiotoxicity, especially at higher doses.
Awesome, thanks. I think Bernardo has a question now that I'd like to ask. So if he's around, you can do that.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi, Hamilton, we can hear you. So I'm a quick question. So I'm a PhD student at Andrea's lab, Andrea Brand's lab. She's a pioneer in the neurostem cell research. And I'm researching kind of the fundamental biology behind neurogenesis and reactivation of stem cells. And I was recently shown that DMT can induce neurogenesis in vivo in mice. And so I was just wondering, what is your view on using psychedelics to treat neurodegenerative diseases and also for enhancement of cognitive abilities? And also you mentioned Gdnf, also the link to BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's promising. I think it's worthy of research and investigation. There's a pharmacologist named David Olson who has been publishing a lot about the potential neurotrophic factor releasing properties of various psychedelics. And I think it's an exciting area of research. I would say, a little bit skeptical of some of the work, but like many of these things, this research is in its infancy, and I think that there's a lot of potential. And, I certainly hope that neurogenesis from psychedelics will have therapeutic applications. But like many of these things, I'm hopeful, but also, very cautious in how I think about how these things will play out in the future.
Cool. So Eduardo's got a question about the subjective effects of Iboga, and he asked, what did Iboga feel like to you? What was the experience like? And did you experience anything religious or spiritual about the experience like the Bwiti we're talking about?
Yeah, I wish I hadn't shown myself using it at all. I mean, I have a lot of creative freedom in what I do. And one of the only, and I got into a lot of arguments about this because I knew if there was even 1 second of me consuming Iboga, it would just, all people would want to know is, what did it feel like for me? And that was the only thing I didn't want. That was the main thing I didn't want to become the emphasis. And of course, I think it actually is maybe 3 seconds of me doing it. And then that becomes the predominant response. And there was even a news article that was like, Hamilton Morris gets high on Iboga. Like, that's the only thing to say about the episode when it represents less than 1% of it. So, I was really trying to show the Bwiti response more than my own, and to show how it exists within a religious context. But in terms of my own response to it, yeah, I think it's totally amazing. And I am not, I think that a lot of people have a tendency to talk about psychedelic experiences as if they're on some kind of continuum with spirituality at the highest point. And like, if you don't have a spiritual, some kind of like supernatural experience, you didn't really do it, or I don't know. And that's just not really the direction that my consciousness tends to move. I had a very psychologically interesting experience where I reflected on my life. And in some sense, I would say that it was the most logical I've ever felt in my entire life. I felt hyper logical and hyper critically aware of my own behavior and my relationships with other people, almost like I was, an observer on my own life. And I could see it with a certain objectivity that I'd never had before, which is not what you typically think of when you think of a psychedelic experience. You think of, realizing that everything is made of love or something like that. This was a very rational experience. And I think that the ritual also plays a big role, because you have, like the Queen Mother of Sacred Waters said, you have 5 days of fasting where even the water that you drink is in iboga tea. So the only food you're consuming is iboga. The only water you consume is iboga tea. You are being totally saturated with iboga. And I think that one of the things that this ritual does to you is it basically, okay, this is a kind of a weird take on this, because in another one of the episodes of my most recent season, I interviewed breatharians. I don't know if everyone here knows what breatharianism is, but it's the sort of fraudulent pseudoscientific idea that certain highly evolved spiritual people no longer require food or even water and can extract all of their nutrients from some kind of ether that nourishes them. Okay, so that's obviously ridiculous. But why do people do that? I think whenever you look at a ridiculous practice, you always have to ask, well, let's get over its ridiculous aspect of this and think, what psychologically is this practice doing for people? And I think what it's doing and why it's empowering is that it emphasizes self-sufficiency, that you have what you need inside you, that you have tremendous reserves of energy inside you, and that you can nourish yourself, that you don't need a glass of water right now, that you don't need to pee right now, you don't need to go eat a sandwich right now, you have it within you. And I think that there's a lot of that idea within the ceremony of self-sufficiency, that you don't need drugs, you don't need sleep, you don't need food, you don't need to sit down. You can dance for 15 hours if you have to, because the power is within you. And I think that that's really strengthening for a lot of the participants.
Yeah, awesome. There's a few more questions about your subjective effects. I hope people won't mind if I skip over those, because that's a great summary of them. There's a couple of questions about the working out the source of the tramadol in the environment in Africa. So Med has asked, if 30% is excreted in urine as tramadol and 60% as a metabolite, there should be an equation to sort out the origins if the population's known, and have the metabolic pathways in the cows through CYP2D6 been investigated.
Yeah, so the mammalian metabolites of tramadol were found in Nauclea latifolia. So, I don't know that they did an exact profiling to see if it matched, the bovine metabolites, but I think it's, the real mystery is where it came from anthropogenically. I don't think that the plants, or I'd be very surprised. Actually, right now, I have some Nauclea latifolia that I collected in Cameroon. Because of the pandemic, I have not had the opportunity to analyze it yet, but I'm going to bring it to the lab and see. And I would bet that there's no tramadol in here, but maybe I'll let you all know if there is. But and so yeah, I think that it is not being biosynthesized by plants. What I find it's interesting on a philosophy of science level, how you can have these different groups providing scientific evidence while not actually addressing the truth in any meaningful way. So then you have the Boomengel group comes up with this elaborate biomimetic synthesis of tramadol to show that it could be biosynthesized from phenylalanine. Okay, well, just because you can devise a potential biosynthetic route doesn't mean that it was biosynthesized. And it just goes back and forth between them. What I would have really loved, that would have added another tier of complexity to this, would have been the possibility if there were radiocarbon as a result of the methyl groups on the tramadol molecule being derived from methanol that was derived from plants. Now, industrially, methanol is typically, I think, made via some oxidation of methane, but historically it was made from plants, from, it's called wood alcohol for that reason. So wouldn't that have been funny if it was had the radiocarbon because it was actually partially botanically derived, but that was not the case.
So a question from Sam. What do you think Ibogaine can teach us about dissociative experiences, especially in comparison to salvia and the aryl cyclohexylamines in terms of their routes of action?
Teach us. Well, it's like Ibogaine has such a complicated pharmacology. It's like, it's hard to even call it a dissociative or a psychedelic. It's almost its own thing. You have like you have the alpha 3 beta 4 nicotinic acetylcholine receptor antagonist activity. You have serotonin transporter. You have kappa opioid receptor 5-HT2A, NMDA. You have all these different sites of action, and then it's also being used at very high doses where you could say, oh, well, the affinity for those sites is pretty low. Yeah, but in some instances people are using grams of this stuff, and then that kind of thing does become relevant potentially. So it's really hard to say what is doing what to people, but it does. And then on top of that, you have all this neurotrophic factor release that's hypothetically contributing to the effect as well. Yeah, so what can you learn about the dissociative experience from Ibogaine? I don't know, really. It's maybe, I suppose, if I want to like tie it back to the natural synthetic dichotomy, there is this idea that dissociatives are unnatural, right? That because PCP and ketamine are not really related to any natural products, and there aren't any natural substances that most people are aware of that are NMDA antagonists, but they're natural too. And of course, Ibogaine has that type of activity. And it even has a structure-activity relationship that seems to be more reflective of that than a typical serotonergic psychedelic, where the 5,6 dimethoxy substituent, which is called ibogaine, is even more potent than Ibogaine. Whereas that sort of substitution pattern would attenuate potency in a classical psychedelic. So it is operating differently. Yeah, so that maybe dissociation is natural. That's one thing that you could say about it, which also came up in the Xenon episode. Xenon is another instance of a natural NMDA antagonist that's in every breath that we take.
Cool. This is a really interesting question from Isla. A recent Nature paper was published in December 2020 developing a non-hallucinogenic analog of Ibogaine tested on mice. What are your views on this paper, and do you think that a non-hallucinogenic synthetic Ibogaine could be effective in addressing addiction?
Yeah, I've read the paper. I mean, I mentioned this researcher, David Olson, earlier, and I think it's interesting. I'm open to anything, whatever people want to do. I think that's fantastic. You want to try to strip away the psychedelic activity and see if that has improved therapeutic effects. Fantastic. I encourage that. It's been done historically with 18-MC, and it doesn't have the neurotrophic factor release, if I remember correctly. So you often, maybe you strip one thing away, you might lose something else as well. So I don't remember if Olson looked at that. It wouldn't surprise me if he did, actually, because he seems to be somewhat oriented toward Gdnf. But anyway, I'll double check that. 18-MC certainly never seems to have gotten off the ground. It's been talked about for, I think, decades at this point. And so that was the first the first attempt to strip away the psychedelic activity of an Ibogaine derivative, actually in that instance, a voacangine derivative, and didn't seem to work out, but I don't know exactly why. You'd have to talk to the researchers if it was due to funding issues, political issues, or if it actually had to do with lack of efficacy. Okay,
cool. Reed Brooks has a question. So if you'd like to unmute, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I just had a question on, for one, super big fan. It's crazy that I'm getting to talk to you, but preserving natural psychedelic drugs like in the world. I was like, you had talked, I was going through your catalog of like podcasts, and I think on the first Joe Rogan experience you did, you talked about the presence of ancient drugs and the idea, just briefly, of like drugs pre-human, psychedelic and psychoactive drugs pre-human interaction with them. And I was wondering what you think of, do you think it's relevant scientifically to look at maybe natural drugs that we haven't discovered or don't have a history of anthropological use? Are they still relevant chemically or botanically or biologically, do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the perfect example of that is 5-MeO-DMT containing Bufo alvarius venom. I suppose you could argue that there is a tradition in the form of other 5-MeO-DMT containing plants, but there's these different Anodonanthera species, but none of them are like Bufo alvarius venom, which is, as far as I'm concerned, and I think as far as any analytical work that has been done is concerned, is pretty much just the effect of smoked 5-MeO-DMT. Maybe there's 1% bufotenine in there, but that's something that did not have a tradition attached to it, Bufo alvarius venom smoking, and that has now become one of the most prominent psychedelics in use today. So that's an example. And I think that there are many others. I mean, even things like salvia, although they were in use and there is a tradition, it's become so much bigger than it ever was in the past once it was, available in like gas stations all over America. And I think that there are going to be all sorts of things discovered. I mean, another example would be, I wrote an article with Jason Wallach some years ago about 5-bromo-DMT. That is a naturally occurring psychedelic. In fact, it is the only psychedelic that has been isolated from a marine organism, and only a marine organism. And after we published that paper, research chemical vendors started selling it and people started using it. So that had no history of human use whatsoever. It had just been found in nature. Jason and I published on it. And now I think you can, to this day, buy it from Chinese chemical supply companies. So, and whether that's good, I don't know, but it is happening.
Well, and then if you don't mind, may I ask a follow-up question kind of to
Sure.
that? Do you think like the sustainability things you mentioned, especially in this episode of Hamilton's Pharmacopeia, do you think that there's a larger urgency to finding these natural compounds before they're destroyed in biodiverse areas and categorizing them before they're affected by human activity or by just natural habitat destruction?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you don't know what's out there until you look, and there very easily could be absolutely amazing things that just haven't been discovered yet. I mean, there's that famous example of, it was a what is it, Dictyonema huarani that Wade Davis discovered. It's never been, that supposedly contained psilocin, although I think they weren't able to get a reference sample to demonstrate this in the one analytical paper that was published, which is a little bit bizarre, I think, but because you can get reference samples for that pretty easily. Yeah, so, but I mean, imagine that's, psilocin found in a totally unusual organism, assuming that the analysis is correct. And that's just a one-off discovery. What if it weren't present in other organisms? That could have been the discovery of psilocin. I mean, there's so many possible things out there, so much chemical space to explore. And I think actually it comes, like, the increased analytical capabilities that we have now are both an advantage and a disadvantage in this case, because when you look at a lot of these papers that are being published where people are finding this or that in nature, and the same question is emerging of, is it a natural product or is it something that is being biosynthesized by an organism? It's hard to tell when you're using these ultra-sensitive analytical instruments. Is it contamination? There's a paper that came out of Nigeria where they claim to have found quaalude in a plant. I assume it was just an analytical mistake. There's a famous paper from the 90s with an acacia species, Acacia rigidula, where they claim to have found mescaline, amphetamine, methamphetamine, DMT, and nicotine in the plant. That was just some very messy analysis, I assume, because it's never been replicated. And you can give many more examples of that as well. Or there's another example that was published more recently of oxycodone being found in an orchid that I can almost guarantee was just sloppy analysis. So yes, people should look, but as we increasingly contaminate our environment, I think we'll be forced to confront the same question of, is it even natural to begin with, over and over again?
Awesome. Luke also has a question, if he's here.
Yeah. So in the UK and the US, I imagine they're looking at using tramadol as a treatment for like heroin addiction. I know that there's SNRI antagonists in that as well. So would the Iboga have SNRI qualities that would be beneficial to the detox as well? Or is it purely, what receptors does it work on? It's kind of what I'm asking here.
Yeah, I mean, it's true that tramadol has this more complicated pharmacology than a traditional opioid. I don't know that mediates the withdrawal. I mean, I'm also aware, of course, that there's a discontinuation syndrome associated with the use of SSRIs and maybe SNRIs. I don't know about norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor discontinuation syndrome. I guess you could see what happens to people that take high doses of Strattera for long periods of time and see if they suffer. I would imagine that if it exists, it's less severe or represents one of the less severe aspects of, I would imagine the majority of withdrawal associated with discontinuation of tramadol is mediated by the mu opioid receptor. And when you're talking about the pharmacology of Ibogaine, you also have to, of course, talk about noribogaine, which is the major metabolite and is produced in a dose-dependent manner. So the demethylation of that oxygen occurs very rapidly and efficiently at low doses, at like a sort of microdose, to the point that Dalibor Sammis, the chemist at Columbia that I mentioned earlier, he very firmly believes that when people microdose Ibogaine, they're essentially just taking noribogaine, and that in order to get the effect of actual Ibogaine, you need to take these very, very high doses that are used either traditionally or in some of these detox centers where they give you a so-called flood dose. And, yeah, it's a ton. You can see the full spectrum of receptor affinities. There's a nice table on Wikipedia, but, it's an antagonist at alpha-3 beta-4 nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, has activity at the serotonin reuptake, the serotonin transporter, dopamine transporter, sigma receptor, kappa opioid receptor, on and on and on and on. It's a very promiscuously binding molecule. And then you also have to, like I said, integrate noribogaine into that equation as well.
There's a few questions about the cardiotoxicity of Ibogaine. So Gerald asks, has the tribe you worked with experienced any prevalence of adverse effects related to the cardiotoxicity of high-dose Ibogaine? And do you know whether there's a difference between the bark and the active ingredient in causing the cardiotoxicity?
Well, yeah, so the cardiotoxicity of Ibogaine is thought to be mediated by a blockade of a potassium ion channel called the hERG channel. And dose-dependent blockade, this is actually a undesirable target of a number of different substances. A lot of topical anesthetics actually are also block the hERG channel. And they were aware of the toxicity of it, and they actually talk about it in the piece. They say we have our own posology, and they give a certain amount to infants, they give a certain amount to the elderly, they give a certain amount to people who are suffering from opioid addiction, they give a different amount to people that are there suffering some kind of spiritual crisis. And that's really what they do, and they take pride in it, is this kind of evaluation. Who are you? What day of the ceremony is it? How strong are you? What can you take? What do you need? And they even have a technique that they sometimes use, because at very high doses, Ibogaine will cause unconsciousness. It will become an anesthetic, and they will prick you with a thorn And if you're completely unresponsive, that's one way that they know you've had enough. If you are basically unconscious and anesthetized by the intensity of the iboga experience. But no, I didn't ask them, like, have you observed QT interval prolongation as a result of giving people iboga, because they don't have an EKG there. And so it's hard to like medically characterize the exact nature of the toxicity that they would have observed, but they said that they were aware that it could be dangerous and they were aware that it could kill people. Although I don't believe anyone had died at that particular church that I was at.
Okay, Rob has a question about bufo alvarius, and he asks, with bufo containing 5-MeO-DMT, what's your understanding of reactivations, and do you think the cause of reactivations, so what do you think the cause of the reactivations and residual effects are, and does synthetic 5-MeO cause the same effects?
Yes, synthetic does. So this does seem to be a 5-MeO-DMT mediated phenomenon. You know, a lot of idiosyncratic adverse reactions to psychedelics are a little bit hard to study. The same is true of HPPD. And the majority of people that use psychedelics don't experience it. It seems that people that don't use psychedelics at all sometimes experience similar phenomena. And so it's hard to say what is happening. I would be lying if I tried to give you some kind of precise pharmacological explanation for reactivation. Is it you're having a very, very dramatic experience? Is it a strong memory? Is it some kind of epigenetic change? I don't know. But it's pretty widely reported. I think one thing to keep in mind is that 5-MeO-DMT has a pretty different pharmacology than DMT. That's one reason that it's such a different substance. I mean, it's really, at least at the high doses, tends to produce a sort of dissociative experience where you're completely cut off from your environment. You are not you. You are not wherever you are. You are somewhere else. And that seems to be mediated by the 5-HT1A receptor, or at least other high potency 5-HT1A receptor agonists also produce that kind of dissociative state. And I'm saying dissociative not in the NMDA antagonist sense, but in the just dissociation sense. Okay.
From Grant, as psychedelics are becoming more socially accepted and legalized, such as in Oregon, what do you think the commercial market will be like for biotech startups working towards monetizing these compounds? And do you think that Big Pharma will ever get on board?
Well, Big Pharma is already on board. I mean, Compass Pathways is a publicly traded pharmaceutical company. You can buy stock in them right now. It's happened. It's happening very seriously as we speak. I'm getting an email almost every day from some startup somewhere asking me to be on their board of advisors, and it's hard for me to even tell what's real, what's fake, what makes sense. You know, it's always some guy. I'm starting a 5-MeO-DMT company. I'm starting the psilocin company. It's so hard to tell what is real, especially when it comes to Canada, because Canada seems to have much more liberal laws when it comes to these things. So what is the future? Well, assuming that things go well, the future could be very similar to what has happened with cannabis, where you have pharmaceutical companies that are investing in the development of cannabinoid therapeutics, and you simultaneously have a non-pharmaceutical market where people are able to, in some areas, grow cannabis on their own for their own personal consumption, which I think is really a necessary freedom that we should all strive for. The ability to work with these things on your own if you so choose. There are companies developing various therapeutic modalities, whether it's VR modulated therapeutic experiences or specialized types of talk therapy. That's all happening. You have people that are starting centers where it's distributed like cannabis in a dispensary. I mean, you have everything under the sun seems to be happening simultaneously. And I'm very excited by it. It feels, I just hope that I hope that it goes well. I really hope for the best, because I think that this could end a lot of suffering and bring a lot of freedom to people that have had to live in fear of their interest of this area.
Cool. We've got a question from Rob, if you'd like to unmute. No, okay, we can come back to Rob. Oh, sorry, go
man.
ahead.
Hey, no, to be honest with you, you asked my question. It was the Bufo 5-MeO reactivation question, man. So much appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you for answering, Hamilton. That's brilliant.
Okay, no worries. Gage also has a question, if he'd like to
go. Hello. So I saw that you were talking a little bit about the head twitch response a while back in one of the podcasts. So basically, the 5-HT2A receptor agonists seem to induce this head twitch response, and people think that it might be indicative of like maybe psychedelic tripping. But the thing that's really interesting is I recently read that THC and other CB1 agonists actually suppress the head twitch response, which is kind of interesting. And also antagonists of CB1 also induce it without psychedelics, and they enhance it with psychedelics, even CBD, which is kind of interesting too. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you have any thoughts about the implications of that or what it might mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think one really important thing to consider when you're talking about the head twitch response is, we're very confident at this point that the head twitch response is mediated by 5-HT2A. So that's something, but that doesn't mean that it's a psychedelic effect necessarily, especially when you're talking about rodents. And so, like Jason in that he's referring to a podcast on my Patreon, which I appreciate you bringing up. And Jason gave a really good example, which is like, could serotonin syndrome, which is not considered a psychedelic state, could that induce HTR because you have overactivation of serotonin receptors, including 5-HT2A. So there's all kinds of examples you can think of that will modulate 5-HT2A in some way that might be undesirable or camouflaged by other types of off-target activity. And I'd have to look specifically at the cannabinoid papers you're describing. I've seen them a while ago, but I would want to just really carefully assess the methods before commenting on them. But yeah, it's certainly, it's one of the best models we have, but it's not perfect.
Okay, Martin asks, you mentioned on Twitter recently that you wish there was more research on the activity of DMT in subjects pre-treated with ketanserin or other antagonists, because there are anecdotal reports that it does not block smoke DMT effect. Do you think that there could be other mechanisms in play other than 5-HT2A? Are there studies on serotonin antagonist pre-treated subjects then dosed with ayahuasca?
Yeah. I think that, that was a really a wonderful traditional way of conducting pharmacology experiments. Like when you look at the really early Rick Strassman experiments that were done in the late 80s, early 90s, he was, doing it didn't have much of a therapeutic orientation at all. It was really just basic human psychopharmacology. What dose does what is the response? What kinds of changes in various biological parameters in temperature and release of hormones can be observed, that sort of thing. And Rick Strassman did a really interesting experiment with Pindolol, which is a 5-HT1A antagonist. And when you co-administer Pindolol with DMT, it actually increases, according to the Strassman research, it increases the intensity of the experience. I talked with Strassman about this recently to ask him if he had any more granular information about what happened to the subjects who had been given Pindolol in addition to DMT, and he didn't have all that much to say beyond that it was reported to be more intense. I've tried the combination myself using the exact same doses that Rick Strassman described, and what I found was even stranger, which is that it for me did not increase the intensity of the experience, but it dramatically prolonged the duration of the experience, which is something that you might expect from, like, for example, an MAOI, but Pindolol is not an MAOI. So I think that's useful information. I don't know what to make of it exactly, but I think that we can learn a lot about what does what in our mind via these carefully designed experiments with antagonists. And given that you hear all sorts of, self-described psychonaut types saying, oh, you've got to try a combination of Ibogaine and 5-MeO DMT and 2CB and GHB, that's that, and then do a whippet. That's like the best thing. And I would just love it if some of these people also took interest in the more methodical self-experimentation that would involve the use of antagonists like ketanserin or pindolol or whatever. Of course, I wouldn't truly advocate for that, but just to be aware of that is an also interesting thing that could potentially be beneficial, because it's very hard to do those sorts of experiments even now, and it's very easy for someone to just try that out if they're curious. But of course, don't do it if you don't know exactly what you're doing, and be extremely cautious. I don't recommend that like you do something like that recklessly. And do I think, more generally, do I think more than 5-HT2A is involved? Yeah, I do.
Okay, there's an interesting question from Randon saying, do you think that a synthetically designed RNA molecule, such as an RNA aptamer for serotonin receptors or other known psychoactive related receptors, could they be psychedelic or psychoactive when administered?
I don't know, maybe. I mean, there's also like no psychedelic peptides that I'm aware of. I would have to just really think about, specifically what you're describing, and, you'd have to like dock it in the receptor and think about the pharmacokinetics and all that sort of thing. But maybe, yeah, maybe. It's a cool idea. I hope you research it. It sounds interesting.
A question from Scott. What do you think about the therapeutic applications of psychedelics for people on the autism spectrum?
Some guy gave me an entire book that he wrote about that subject, who's autistic and felt that it had this dramatic therapeutic effect for him. A lot of these things are still in the realm of anecdotal reports. So like, what can I say other than some guy, told me that it was amazing for him, and that if you're in a position to study it, maybe it would be useful. I think that there are a lot of people that seem to benefit psychologically with a variety of different disorders. And it's really hard to make blanket statements about, will it help depression? Will it help OCD? Will it help addiction? Will it help autism? Because it probably boils down to the individual and their intention, their attitude toward the use of these things, what dose they're using, how frequently, what their environment is. I mean, there's so many variables with psychedelics that have to be considered, but I think we're slowly answering these questions.
Okay, a question from Nia. Do you have an opinion on the therapeutic potential of cannabidiol? And do you think that one danger of psychedelics is that they can be misused to psychologically influence people under increased suggestibility? So I think that's two questions there.
Yeah, those seem like very separate questions. That they can be used to, well, I mean, am I concerned about that? Well, the government has already tried to do that during MK Ultra. It was explored pretty extensively. Can psychedelics be used to reprogram people's personalities and create a sort of Manchurian candidate? Can psychedelics be used as truth serums? They don't seem to be especially good at it, but I think it's clear at the very least that they can be used to traumatize people, to hurt them very badly. And again, this boils down to set and setting. So you have there was a chemist, an LSD chemist, who wrote a book that I'm going to forget the name of. It's a very bizarrely shaped, extremely long book called, his name's Franklin something, and it's I can't remember the name of this book, but anyway, he describes the glory of taking some absurdly high dose of LSD, something like 10 milligrams of LSD, and how this was the greatest experience ever to take 10 milligrams, and that was when he really truly understood LSD. Well, that same dose given to someone in the context of a military experiment could cause lifelong psychological damage, and that's why set and setting and context are so important for these substances. It's not like a stimulant or something like that, where you have a kind of a much simpler, less environmentally dependent response to it. And that's why you have to really think about the context whenever you're asking any of these questions.
Cool. Well, I think that's all the questions from the chat. I had one brief one that you may get asked a lot, but I was wondering, due to the current legal status of a lot of drugs, do you ever have problems with your filming, and what kind of legal support do you have while making your documentaries? And have you ever had to cut footage that you wanted to include?
I have no support. I have the opposite of support. I have interference, continuous interference with everything that I do. And I think that there's this idea that I've grown to find very annoying that like Vice creates things. Like I saw in I shouldn't have even looked at the chat because it just put me in a bad mood as soon as I saw it. But like someone was saying like, oh, it's so Vice to do dance hall music. No, it was the Tramadol song, by the way. But like Vice doesn't do this stuff. I do it, and Vice gives me money, and they continuously interfere as I'm making it, telling me that everything I do is legally questionable. And it's really hard. And, you know, for example, when I synthesized the 5-MeO-DMT in Mexico, I had to pay for the transportation of all of that equipment to the lab. I had to find the lab. I had to hire an independent lawyer to demonstrate that 5-MeO-DMT was not a controlled substance in Mexico, while the entire legal team at Vice argued with me and told me that 5-MeO-DMT and DMT were the same chemical. I had to indemnify the company so that if anything happened, they wouldn't be held accountable. So there's continuous legal interference with everything that I do. And I have to basically just toe the line carefully so that I know that when it comes down to it, I have not broken the law. And when it comes to, and everything beyond that, I just fight. I fight and fight and fight to make sure that it can be done. So if it's, you know, showing the synthesis of methamphetamine, I fight to show that it can be done. If it's showing the synthesis of 5-MeO-DMT, I had to hire independent legal counsel. If it's the synthesis of Ibogaine, I had to demethylate the BOACAN gene before the demethoxycarbonylation. I mean, these are the sorts of things that had to be done. It was not trivial at all. And it's kind of sad that it had to be so insanely difficult. Like I really wish it weren't so hard. And that's another thing, is that just the storytelling, being able to tell these stories could be so much easier in a more liberal environment where people didn't have to worry about being locked in cages just to talk about, you know, the religious use of a plant or whatever. So yeah, it's not easy. And I do obey the laws even when I don't agree with them. You know, the idea of having to demethylate an oxygen to demonstrate a chemical reaction is totally and completely absurd to me, but that's the law of the country that I live in. So I'll, you know, thanks to Mike Cunningham and co at Columbia for helping me out with that.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare, but I'm sure we're all incredibly grateful that you do carry on with your work, because it's fantastic. I think that is all the questions. So yeah, let's finish up there. Before we finish, I think there's time to just plug two things. Hamilton, would you like to promote your book?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for reminding me. So, I wish I had a copy. Right, I should have grabbed it. Anyway, I have this this book that Ken Nelson wrote that I republished. It's this very beautiful pamphlet that is really the first piece of writing about the smoking of bufo alvarius venom, and it then also contains a new section that describes the sustainable, low-cost, green synthesis of 5-MeO-DMT, as well as the history of Ken Nelson's research. And you can buy that at www.psychedelictoadofthesonoran-desert.com. And all of the proceeds go to the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's Research. So, and then there's other things that also all go to charity, including for the legal defense of a chemist who was recently arrested for synthesizing DMT and MDMA. So it's all charitable, and it's a really nice handmade book. It's cool.
We put the link to that on the event, so if anyone wants to buy it, you can check that out. And the final thing to promote is we've recently got some new Psychedelic Society merchandise. So if anyone wants to buy a t-shirt, you can check out our Facebook page, and there's some other stuff to get. So with that, I'll say thank you very much to Hamilton. It's been a fantastic, well, afternoon, I guess, for you, but fantastic evening for us. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. And I hope in the UK you're able to watch it on a non-streaming thing. It's hard for people to find the show. But yeah, thanks for everyone that came and listened.
Thanks, Hamilton.
Okay.
Thank you.